this lecture, we are going to discuss the United States government. We're going to talk about the difference between federal, state, and local governments. We're going to talk about the three branches of the U.S. federal government. We're going to talk about two ideas that support this organization of the U.S. federal government. And we will close by looking at the structure of state governments. When we talk about the organization of government throughout the United States, we need to understand that when we're discussing federal laws, we're talking about laws that have U.S.-wide applicability. That means that regardless of what state you live in, this is a law that applies to you or to the area that you live in. When we're talking about state-level laws, these are laws that apply only to that particular territorial jurisdiction. And I just mean a state. And so four examples of states are Georgia, Alabama, California, and Florida. Over here, you see I've used the postal code abbreviations, GA for Georgia, AL for Alabama, etc. Throughout the notes, this is how I'm going to abbreviate these states. I'll always read them out, but in case you're referencing these course materials without the narration, if you're unsure what a particular abbreviation is, if you go to your search engine of choice and you search up U.S. postal code abbreviations, you'll find them right away. Finally, when we're talking about local government, we're referring to a specific city, village, or town. There are three branches of the U.S. federal government. They include the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch is responsible for making laws, and it's made up by the House of Representatives and the Senate. The executive branch is responsible for executing and implementing laws. It's made up of the president and federal agencies. And finally, we have the judicial branch, which interprets and adjudicates laws. It's made up of district courts, circuit courts, and the Supreme Court. And with regards to the hierarchy here, the district courts are on the bottom, the circuit or appellate courts are in the middle, and the Supreme Court is at the top. Why are there three branches of government? Well, there are two key ideas that supported this organizational structure. The first one is separation of powers. The idea here is that no one branch would hold all of the power. The power would be distributed across the three branches, and similarly, that those three branches would have checks and balances on each other. And I've provided two examples here. One example is that it's the legislative branch that approves a bill. A bill is what we have before it becomes a law. A bill is then signed into law by the president. So these two branches must work together. But just because a president signs a bill into law doesn't mean that that law will hold. It's possible that the judicial branch can rule that law unconstitutional. In order for a law to have standing power, it needs to be approved by the legislature, it needs to be signed into law by the president, and the courts have to uphold it. With regards to state and local governments, again, the structure for state governments is very similar, if not identical, to what we see at the federal level. That means that state governments also have a legislature, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. There are some odd exceptions throughout the 50 United States, but you don't need to know those for the CIPP US body of knowledge. In this lecture, we've talked about the difference between federal, state, and local governments. We said that a federal law, for example, is something that has nationwide US applicability. A state law is a law that applies only to a particular state, such as Georgia, Alabama, California, or Florida. And a local law would apply to one smaller territory, such as a city, a village, or a town. We talked about the three branches of the US federal government: legislative, executive, and judicial. And we ended by talking about the two ideas that support this organizational structure. Those are separation of powers and checks and balances.